Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be doing my July wrap up and telling you about all the things that I read in the month of July. So I had a really good reading month in July. I read 18 books. 3 of them were unpublished novels that I read for work. I work in publishing, but that means I have 15 books to talk to you about today. Of those 15, 11 of them were for the Jane Austen July readathon that I was hosting along with Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, and then 4 of them were unconnected books that weren't to do with Jane Austen. But I will start off with the Jane Austen July reads and go through the challenges and what I read for them. So the first challenge for Jane Austen July is to read one of Jane Austen's main 6 novels. So I actually reread 3 of her novels this year. First, I reread Emma. This was one of the read-alongs that me and Marissa were hosting, and me and Marissa actually made a video about it on her channel, so I will link that down below. I really enjoyed this reread of Emma. This is the 3rd time I've read Emma, and previously Emma was always in like my lower ranking of Jane Austen novels. It has never been one of my favourites, but actually I really enjoyed this reread and I liked it much more than I had previously. So Emma is a novel about a young woman called Emma Woodhouse. Emma Woodhouse is rich and wealthy and privileged and a little bit vain, a little bit selfish, a little bit ignorant of the feelings of those around her. She means well, but sometimes her good intentions don't always have the best of effects. And Emma, though she has no interest in matrimony herself, quite likes to matchmake other people. And at the beginning of the novel, she makes a new friend called Harriet Smith, who she decides she's going to try and find a husband for, and everything goes on from there. I really love Emma. This reread, I really enjoyed it. Previously, I think I'd always found Emma as a character a bit frustrating because she's not always the most likeable, but actually I liked her more this time reading it. And I think I just enjoyed the whole reading experience much more. Partly, I think because I hadn't read it for a while, and I think because I had in my head that I didn't like it so much, I was just really pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed this. I think it's actually a really great Austen and a really good one to start with because you get into the story straight away and the writing is really clear, and Emma is such a compelling character and such an interesting character, and I really love her character development. Even though she isn't necessarily my favourite Austen heroine, I feel like her character development over the novel is so strong that that's something I really enjoyed. And I also really enjoyed like all the little subplots and tracing the subplots throughout the book. I think Emma is one of the books that has the most like interesting subplots, so I really enjoyed rereading it and like spotting all the threads going through the novel in that way too. So yeah, this was a really great read. I would highly recommend Emma, and I'm so glad I reread it because I really loved it a lot more than I had previously. Emma is definitely moving up my Austen rankings. I think it might be like battling Persuasion for number 3 after Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park, but we'll see what happens. I'll probably reread Persuasion in like the next year or 2 and change my mind again, so who knows. I love Austen a lot. Anyway, talking of my other favourite 2 Austens, I also reread Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park. Pride and Prejudice was our other read-along read. I listened to this on audiobook, which meant my attempt at following the read-along schedule didn't quite work out, but I really loved rereading this again. I have read Pride and Prejudice so many times, I'm going to say about 9 or 10 times. I've listened to the audiobook narrated by Rosamund Pike about 5 times. It's such a good audiobook, and I just really love listening to Pride and Prejudice. I feel like it's such a comfort read, and it's especially a comfort read when I'm listening to it rather than physically reading it. I'm so familiar now with that audiobook, and also the chapters are so short, they're all like 15 or 20 minutes, that actually it's just like the perfect audiobook to listen to. Anyway, Pride and Prejudice. You probably know the basic premise of Pride and Prejudice. It is about a family called the Bennet family. There are 5 daughters within the Bennet family and their parents. And Mr. Bennet, the father, his estate is entailed on the male line, so none of his daughters can inherit his property, meaning that it's kind of imperative for at least one of them to find a wealthy husband who can support all 5 of the sisters. So the book basically follows Elizabeth and Jane, the 2 elder siblings, and their kind of romantic and social interactions. I love Pride and Prejudice a lot. It is one of the best love stories ever. I love Pride and Prejudice. It is a wonderful love story. It is a brilliant, beautiful novel. It's so funny as well, and all of the characters are so delightful and fantastic, and yeah, this was really great to read again and lovely to read it with so many people as well, and I don't think I will ever get bored of Pride and Prejudice. I think it's one of those books I could just read over and over again and thoroughly enjoy it every single time. So because I finished listening to Pride and Prejudice a bit early, I then also decided to listen to Mansfield Park, which is my second favourite Jane Austen novel. I'm slightly cheating including this in this wrap up because I actually finished it on the 2nd of August, but you know, I listened to the bulk of it in July, so we'll count it for here. I love Mansfield Park a lot. It is a very underrated Jane Austen novel. It is a lot of people's least favourite, but I am so fond of it. I think it's truly brilliant and I love it. And it's another one where I have a really good audiobook that I've listened to 3 times, I want to say. The audiobook narrated by Frances Barber, and so every time I listen to it, it's just really comforting because I know the audiobook well and I know like the characters' voices already, and it's just a really enjoyable experience. So Mansfield Park follows a young woman called Fanny Price. We start off the book in her childhood. She's 10 years old and she is sent away from her parents to live with her aunt and uncle because her parents do not have very much money and her aunt and uncle do. Her uncle is a baronet. So Fanny Price, from the age of 10, is raised by her aunt and uncle along with her 4 cousins, including one of her cousins, Edmund, who she is a little bit in love with for the whole book. And the book follows her growing up, sort of mostly taking place when she's about 17 or 18 years old, and what happens when some new neighbours move next to Mansfield Park, the place where she lives with her cousins and aunt and uncle, and these new neighbours are called the Crawfords, and they are like a really disruptive force and change everything. I love Mansfield Park hugely. I know that it's not a lot of people's favourite Jane Austen books. I don't think it is the most satisfying of her love stories, but Fanny Price as a character I just love. She's very quiet, she's very introverted, she's very like softly spoken and meek, but at the same time she's also really strong and she knows her own mind and heart, and she has like a great moral conscience, and kind of knows herself very well. I feel like in Emma, one of the things I love is how brilliant Emma's character development is. One of the things I love in Mansfield Park is that Fanny Price doesn't really have character development because she doesn't need it. She's already the person she wants to be, and it's everyone around her that has to like change and grow, and Fanny Price is just stable and constant and awesome, and I love her. It's such a good book. I really love it. It's funny and it's witty and it's moving and it's just beautiful, and yeah, I love Mansfield Park a lot. The second challenge for Jane Austen July was to read something by Jane Austen that's not one of her main 6 novels, so for that I read some of her Juvenilia. I was also planning on reading her letters, but I didn't manage to get around to it this time, but I have read them before, so I don't really mind. These were rereads for me as well. I read The Beautiful Cassandra, this little book here, and then I read some of this. So this is Sanditon, Lady Susan and the History of England. This collection has Lady Susan and her unfinished books, but it also has all her Juvenilia too, so I've read like basically the first half of this book. So it's really, really nice to reread Jane Austen's Juvenilia. I love her Juvenilia so much. It is completely bonkers and bizarre and absurd and full of like surreal stuff happening, and lots of like poisonings and murders and much more scandal than you would get in one of Jane Austen's full-length novels, but her Juvenilia is just amazing. I think my favourite piece of her Juvenilia is called Jack and Alice, which is just wonderful. I actually made a whole video about her Juvenilia during Jane Austen July, so I'll link that down below if you'd like to know more of my thoughts of her Juvenilia, because I talked about all of it there. I love her Juvenilia a lot. It was really fun to reread it this year, and nice as well, I think, because I've read this one quite a lot of times. It was nice to read more stuff that was in here that I hadn't actually read for quite a few years, and I'd only read once before, so that was really fun. I love Jane Austen's Juvenilia. It's bizarre in all the best ways. The third challenge for Jane Austen July was to read a non-fiction book about Jane Austen or her time, and so for this I picked up Jane Austen, the Banker's Sister by E.J. Clary. This is an interesting non-fiction book, mostly about Jane Austen and her relationship with her brother Henry. So it's basically a dual biography of both Henry and Jane, but it also explores Henry's role in the financial world in the late 18th and early 19th century, and how that might have influenced Jane Austen, and talks about kind of economics and money in Jane Austen's books. There were a lot of things in this that I found really fascinating. In general, I'd say it was a really interesting read, and the biographical detail was really interesting. The exploration of money in Jane Austen's novels was really interesting. I really liked how it was written. It was very readable. However, there were like some weird suggestions that Jane Austen was a bit too fond of her brother in a slightly incestuous way, which I felt really didn't need to be in here and were a bit weird and didn't have any evidence or grounding, and just felt like they were shoved in here for a bit of like extra scandal for no reason, so that was a bit weird. It was mostly good except for those few weird sentences, but there we go. Then I also read another non-fiction book this month, which was Courtiers by Lucy Worsley. This was sort of for this challenge and sort of not, because this is about the early Georgian period, so pre-Jane Austen. I thought it might talk about George III as well, but this book is is entirely about George I and George II. George II died like 15 years before Jane Austen was born, so this doesn't really count for Jane Austen July, but I sort of picked it up in the Georgian spirit. This is a really interesting book. As I said, it basically focuses on George I and George II and their court, like the other people who lived in the palaces with them and what they were like. I found this a really interesting read. Lucy Worsley writes brilliantly. She's always a really engaging historian, and I really thoroughly enjoyed this. I feel like she's one of those historians I would read whatever she writes about. So even though like the history of royal families and the monarchy isn't necessarily like my go-to history, I'm more of a social historian, more interested in ordinary people, I still found this really, really interesting. Then the fourth challenge for Jane Austen July was to read a retelling of a Jane Austen book, and for this I read What Kitty Did Next by Carrie Cableen. This is a Pride and Prejudice retelling focusing on Kitty Bennet and what she does after the events of Pride and Prejudice. Kitty Bennet is the fourth sister and quite a minor character in Pride and Prejudice, but this book takes her and does more with her, and I loved it so much. This was definitely like my highlight of Jane Austen July that wasn't actually something written by Jane Austen. It was amazing. A lot of people have been talking lately about The Other Bennet Sister, which focuses on Mary Bennet, and I loved The Other Bennet Sister, I really did, but I read What Kitty Did Next, and I think I like it even more than The Other Bennet Sister, and I think everyone who has loved The Other Bennet Sister, please go read What Kitty Did Next because it's so good as well. I just found it thoroughly enjoyable, so readable. It felt so true to the characters of Jane Austen, and it had like a kind of Jane Austen feel to it, but it also had like so many other interesting elements to it, and I feel like The Other Bennet Sister was a coming-of-age story that became a love story, and I feel like What Kitty Did Next, I started off expecting it to be mostly a love story, and actually it's a coming-of-age story with a little bit of a romantic element, but actually that's not always the focus, which I kind of loved. And because the focus wasn't always on the love story, there were a few like fun feminist elements that I thought were just really well done, and I just thought it was so good, and I really loved it, and the characterization was great, and I thoroughly believed what was done with Kitty and all of the characters around her. Like usually when I read a Jane Austen retelling, there's at least one character where I'm like, I'm not sure that that's how I read that character. But What Kitty Did Next, every character I was like, yeah, totally, completely believe it. I agree, it was perfect. It was so good. It was great, really loved it, highly recommend. Then I also read a rom-com set in the Regency period, which doesn't count for this challenge, but is like in the spirit of Jane Austen July, so I'll talk about it here as it feels like this is the neatest place to put it in. And that was To Have and to Hoax by Martha Waters. So this is a rom-com set in the Regency period. It follows a woman called Violet, who at the beginning of the book has been married for 5 years. Like a year into her marriage, her and her husband had like a terrible falling out, so they now live in the same house but in separate rooms. They never speak to each other, and then at the beginning of the book she gets a letter from one of her husband's friends when her husband is away saying that her husband has been thrown from his horse and injured. She immediately panics that he is, you know, on his deathbed, runs to find him, finds him completely well and recovered, and is really angry that the alarm was set. So she therefore decides to like get her own back, and then they like play pranks on each other. I have really mixed feelings about this book. I started off reading it and I loved it. Like the first few chapters I thought this is fantastic. I really, really loved the writing style, I really enjoyed the tone, I found it really witty and funny. And then as the book went on, I just enjoyed it less and less. It's not to say I didn't like it, I still found it a fun read and I still thought it was really enjoyable. But I just had a few issues which wouldn't go away. So one of the issues I had was that there were quite a few like subplots with Violet's friends that were set up and never went anywhere, and the only thing I can think is that they're set up for like spin-off books. But even then I found it just really unsatisfying in the novel itself, because both her two best friends have like little subplots set up that just never go anywhere and don't have any ending. And then the other thing, which I think is the main thing in this book, is that I just didn't believe the relationship between the two main characters, Violet and James. And I finished off the book feeling thoroughly convinced that they were both very attracted to each other, but not convinced at all that they were in love with each other, because I just never saw that. And you did see that they were attracted to each other, but you never saw that they actually like liked each other or got on with each other or liked spending time with each other in any way that wasn't sexual. And I just didn't believe their relationship, and I didn't feel invested enough in their love because I felt it was all lust and nothing else. And I also didn't believe that if they had loved each other, they could have gone that long without talking to each other. Like, I feel like if it had been a year rather than 4, I might have believed it, but 4 years, I just felt like there was too much that was stretching the believability for me. And there was another thing which I don't know quite how to explain. I really enjoy rom-coms, and I read quite a lot of rom-coms, and I work on quite a lot of rom-coms at work, but I don't read much romance. And I feel like there is a dividing line somewhere between rom-coms and romance. And I feel like at least in UK book publishing, rom-coms are quite distinct from like steamy romance, basically, and romance is like steamy and rom-coms are funny. And I feel like either this book was less of a rom-com than I thought and more of a romance, or I think maybe in US book publishing, rom-coms and romance are more like one genre. To Have and Hoax, I should say, is an American book by an American author, though it's set in Britain. And I feel like there were some certain things that I expect in a rom-com that were different in this. And I don't know if that's because it was a romance, not a rom-com, or because it was American. But I wonder if that's partly a like UK, US publishing difference thing, or just like a, you know, this book is something slightly different thing. I don't know. The 5th challenge for Jane Austen July is to read a book by a contemporary of Jane Austen. So I read 2 things for this. I didn't manage to read Belinda, which was the longer one on my TBR for this, but I did read finally The Castles of Atlin and Dunbayne by Anne Radcliffe. This is a Gothic novel which is about 2 feuding families and what happens when the Earl of one family goes to like try and kill the Baron in revenge, and then the Baron takes him prisoner, and then everything dramatic goes on from there. It's very Gothic, it's quite over the top, it's a bit silly. I quite liked it. So I have a like mixed relationship with pre-Victorian British literature, where basically I adore Jane Austen and everyone else, not so much. And I keep trying with 18th century literature and I keep falling short. And I will keep trying. I do want to read Belinda, and I think I would like to read some of Anne Radcliffe's longer works as well, because I actually really enjoyed Anne Radcliffe's writing style. It felt very like Jane Austen to me, but the content was just so silly and so over the top, and all the characters were so one-dimensional, and they all just didn't have any character development, and they all just had like one trait, which are kind of in All the Men was bravery and in All the Women was like moral angelicness but also patheticness, and I just didn't love that so much. So like I said, I really enjoyed the writing style, so I do think I'd like to read something longer by Anne Radcliffe. This is a really short one, it's really just a novella, so I feel like maybe the characters would be a bit more developed and more complex in other things by her. Hopefully I will read some more by Anne Radcliffe in the future and get on with it a little bit better. Like I said, I really enjoyed her writing, the characters were all a bit nothingy for me, and characters are really important. I'm not saying Jane Austen invented characterization, but everything I read pre-Jane Austen, just the characterization is not there for me, and I miss it. Then the other thing I've read for this challenge was The Task and Other Poems by William Cooper. William Cooper was one of Jane Austen's favourite poets, so I decided to read some of his work. I buddy read this with Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, and didn't really understand it. I think, to be honest, The Task is an epic poem, and I think I would need to sit down and study it and read it like 3 times and listen to it and think really carefully about what every sentence means before I fully understand it, and I didn't do that. And that meant that I didn't get that much out of it. There were some sections that I really enjoyed, bits where there's really beautiful description of nature, and also there are a few sections where Cooper is talking about the slave trade and kind of his arguments for abolition, which I found really interesting because I understood what he was talking about and I knew the historical context enough, and I found it really interesting and really powerful. But kind of in between those bits and the bits about nature, I was just a bit confused, and I didn't fully understand what he was talking about. So, mixed impression of Cooper. I think I would like to try and read more of his short poetry in the future, and possibly I need to just like know more about the background to his work, to be honest, before I go ahead and read it. I will keep trying with 18th century literature, and one day I might find something I adore, but it has not quite happened yet. Then before I go on to the other 4 books I read in July, the last few challenges for Jane Austen July were both watching challenges. So the first one was to watch a direct screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book, and I rewatched the 2005 Pride and Prejudice film, which I hadn't seen for a while, so that was good fun. And I watched that with my partner Nick, who did not like it. He came down firmly on the 1995 side of the debate. I am like in the middle of both of them because I love them both, but there we go. And then for the 7th challenge, which is to watch a modern retelling screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book, I watched some Jane Austen web series on YouTube. I watched Eleanor and Marianne Take Barton, which is a Sense and Sensibility retelling, which I really enjoyed. And then I also watched Rational Creatures, which is a Persuasion retelling, which there are only 6 episodes of so far, but it was so good. And I can't wait to see more when more appears in the future, because it was excellent. And I really enjoyed both of them as well. That was all my reading for Jane Austen July. And then I also read 4 other books in July that were nothing to do with Jane Austen. So I read the Victorian play The Philanderer by George Bernard Shaw, which I really enjoyed. This is a social comedy of manners about a man who has been kind of romantically entangled with one woman and then just also at the same time is romantically entangled to another woman. And of course the women find out and it gets all into a complicated mess. But the more fun thing that I really enjoyed is that most of The Philanderer is set around a particular club in London called the Ibsen Club, where both men and women are members, and where it's all about like gender equality. The 2 women that the Philanderer character is involved with are both members of this club, and so they do not appreciate being treated badly, and there's lots of like fun proto-feminist, feminist stuff in it, which I really enjoyed. So this was a really good read and I'd highly recommend it. George Bernard Shaw is a great playwright and I really enjoy his work. Right at the beginning of the month, I listened on audiobook to Big Little Lies by Leanne Moriarty. Absolutely loved this. This was fantastic. So this is sort of the cross-section between commercial women's fiction and thriller. It's set in Australia and it focuses on 3 women, all of whom are parents to 5-year-olds, and their 5-year-olds all go to nursery, kindergarten, whatever it's called in Australia, together, and the women are drawn together by this and kind of become friends. But we know right from the beginning that something terrible has happened and that someone has died. We don't know who's died, but someone connected with the nursery in some way has died after this kind of dramatic trivia night where something terrible happened. And we know that from the beginning, but we are like going back in time, kind of 9 months before the trivia night, 6 months before the trivia night, etc., working forwards in time towards that night to find out what happened and who it is that is dead. And so like each chapter is from the perspective of one of the main 3 women, like at the time in the past, but at the beginning and end of each chapter we often get like little snippets of interview transcript from one of the other mothers or fathers at the nursery who are like in the future looking back on what happened at the trivia night. So we're like working back and forwards to it all the while, and we know something terrible happened but we don't know what it happened and to whom. And it's great. It was so good. I loved it so much. I just really flew through it and thoroughly enjoyed it. It's one of those books that just I was expecting to like and I just absolutely loved so much more than I could have anticipated. It was so gripping, so wonderful, so like captivating. The characterization was excellent. I loved the twists. I thought the structure kind of working back and forward were brilliant. It was just thoroughly readable, so enjoyable, so well done. Such like brilliant exploration of some really complicated themes. There were several twists in it, and one twist I saw coming, and then the other twist I absolutely did not see coming at all, which I loved. So I highly recommend Big Little Lies by Leanne Moriarty. I cannot wait to read more by Leanne Moriarty. I think she's going to end up being one of those authors I have to read everything by because this was just so good. And I think as well, it just sat at that perfect spot for me where I really enjoy commercial women's fiction and I like some thrillers, but I don't like the thrillers that get too dark and too like psychological constant tension. And I feel like Big Little Lies is the perfect place for me on that spectrum between like mostly being commercial women's fiction that is character driven and about people's relationships with each other, but also with that like hint of suspense and complicated plots that I really enjoy. And I feel like that perfect mix of like character led, personal relationship driven fiction combined with really accessible, readable, engaging writing combined with like a bit of a mystery but not constant action and constant tension. I feel like that's something I mostly find in historical fiction, not contemporary fiction, and it was really lovely to read it in contemporary fiction where, like in a lot of the historical fiction I read, there's like a mystery element but it's not crime as its main thing, and I really enjoyed it in Leanne Moriarty's Big Little Lies, and yes, definitely very excited to read more by her in the future. I think she is entirely up my street. Then I also read It Started With a Secret by Jill Mansell, which is a commercial women's fiction novel, a bit of a rom-com. This I read as a kind of book club that I've been doing with some of my friends. It was good fun. I really liked the writing. It was really readable and engaging. It was fun and I liked the ending, and there was a nice little love story in it, and it was good, but I feel like there were things that I would like to change about it were I editing it. And I don't know if that's partly because I work in this area and I have worked on books in this area and I was reading on my Kindle, which is usually where I read stuff for work. So I don't know if I just had like my editing hat on, but I just kept on thinking of things that I felt would be better in a slightly different way, so that even though I enjoyed it, I didn't think it was perfect. So basically the book is about a young woman called Lainey, and at the beginning of the book the hotel that she works at in France goes bust, so she decides to move back to home to England and get a new job, and she sees this brilliant job advertised for a couple to come and like help a large family who need lots of support at home. But the job opportunity is open for a couple and Lainey is single, but her best friend and colleague Kit, who is a gay man, agrees to pretend to be her boyfriend so that they can take this job together. But then of course Lainey turns up at this new job and there is a man there who she might actually be interested in, but she's pretending to date Kit. Like I said, there were just things that I wanted to tweak about it. Mostly that the secret that Kit and Lainey are keeping comes out really early, like so much earlier than I was expecting it to, and I think so much more could have been done with that really fun setup. And also I really loved Kit as a character. He was probably my favourite character, and I feel like he really took a backseat, especially after the first third of the book, and I wanted much more of Kit in it. So I did enjoy it, but I feel like it had a lot of different elements, and the elements I enjoyed the most were in the first half of the book, so I sort of enjoyed the first half more than the second. But I do think it's worth a read, and I did enjoy it. I like Jill Mansell's writing style very much. I do think she's very funny, but I think there are other authors in this area who I like a bit more, who I will probably try and read more from in the future instead. Then finally, I also reread Artemis Fowl by Owen Colfer, which I listened to on audiobook with Nick. Both of us had read the Artemis Fowl books when we were children, but hadn't read them for a very long time, so we thought it would be fun to re-listen to some of them together on audiobook, and we listened to the first one this month and I really enjoyed it. I remembered very, very little about the Artemis Fowl books, but I enjoyed rereading it and they are really good fun. So basically they're children's books that focus on a boy called Artemis Fowl who is a 12-year-old criminal genius, and what happens when he decides to kidnap a fairy from the other world of fairies and magical creatures that live beneath the surface of Earth, because he wants to get gold from the fairy people, and so we kind of watch this like complicated battle between the fairies and Artemis Fowl. It's really, really good fun. It's very silly and very funny. I really like the character of Holly, who I remember much more clearly than Artemis Fowl actually, who is the fairy he kidnaps, who is a really good character, and I really like their dynamic. And I think it's a really interesting setup for a novel, because you're both like rooting for Holly and also rooting for Artemis Fowl, even though they're on like different sides. Because you do see more about Artemis's life and you kind of understand why he has become the way he is. So I really enjoy the like clash of perspectives there, and I really like the world building. It's very good fun. Like I said, a bit silly, but in the best way. And yeah, those are all the books that I read in July. I feel like I've been talking for a very long time, so I hope this video hasn't been too ridiculously long, but I had a very good reading month. I hope you did too. Please let me know if you took part in Jane Austen July, what your reading highlights of the month were and how you enjoyed it. And that is all for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.